Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Shaheen Hasan. I'm a senior manager at Target Foundation. I'm excited to moderate today's panel discussion titled Achieving Equity Through Community-Based Research. This is a really timely and important topic. The pandemic, which we've heard about and talked about from research earlier in the day, resulting economic upheaval and a long overdue racial justice reckoning has drawn attention to longstanding and worsening socioeconomic inequities for Black, Indigenous, Latinx, and other marginalized communities. We know research can serve as a powerful tool to advance equity, but in order for us to meaningfully promote equitable policies and programs, we must center the expertise and lived experience of the people and communities in the research we study and the solutions that are developed. And this means intentionally centering community input, participation, and priorities in research. Our panel discussion today will focus on power dynamics and shifts in the research field from traditional approaches to community-based participatory ones, where researchers partner with and learn from communities directly for more equitable outcomes. We'll hear from our panelists today who are working to advance more equitable approaches to research that shift power to communities. And if time permits, we may also have space for audience questions. So please do submit your questions in the chat. And with that, I'm really pleased to introduce our two panelists. Jessica Shakesprere is a research analyst at the Center on Labor, Human Services, and Population at the Urban Institute. She's part of a team that is engaging communities to strengthen research design, advance equity and inclusion, and improve policy impact. Sarah Treuhaft is the Vice President of Research at PolicyLink and leads the development of the organization's research agenda and research partnerships. She oversees a National Equity Atlas partnership with USC Dornsife Equity Research Institute. Welcome, and thank you both for joining this discussion. So let's dive right in, and let's start with some definitions and context. What is community-based research? How is it oriented in contrast to traditional mainstream research? And why is it more critical now? Jessica, let's start with you.
Thank you, Shaheen. So as you mentioned, research can drive decision-making, and if evidence matters, we must care how it gets made. And researchers, practitioners, policymakers are realizing the need for and importance of including this type of work. Often known as community-engaged methods, this method involves intentional and explicit inclusion of studied communities as contributors, reviewers, and co-creators in the research process. So thinking about traditional research, there's a long and problematic history of excluding community voice, particularly those of people of color, from research design, implementation, and analysis. Community engaged methods involves researchers, funders, and institutions broadly relinquishing power to make research, including product design and evaluation, more collaborative and inclusive. In the financial empowerment context, we are focused on addressing an individual's deficit oftentimes, but efforts that involve community engaged methods are about creating lasting, meaningful partnerships with individuals, community-based organizations, and others for longer-term financial success for and with families. We know the benefits of financial coaching programs, for example, and that they have been meaningfully shaped by customer and participant needs, but being explicit about some of the structural issues to access and quality are important. So thinking about who is involved with this process, there are a host of stakeholders, including the community, which could be consumers, residents, community-based organizations, as well as researchers, funders, and the audience. And to think about both traditional research methods and maybe some of the benefits of community engaged methods. With traditional research methods, sometimes we have a set of research priorities and agenda, whether through our own research, previous evidence building, through projects, or a policy agenda. But time and time again, marginalized communities see little or no return on investment and feel used by researchers who come in, collect data, and leave. Oftentimes, a community member is asking, who are you? What do you want? And are you going to be gone tomorrow? With using a community-based research approach takes time, energy, and resources. And along with the ethical implications of data collection, it also leads to robust, accurate data. After all, data collection can be a lot better if there's meaningful partnership and trust built in.
Thank you, Jessica. Sarah, I'd like to bring you in to discuss what community-based research looks like, recognizing that there's a spectrum of approaches. Could you add perspective on how PolicyLink approaches this work and what principles inform it?
Yeah, definitely. So, there is a spectrum of research, thinking about traditional research on one end to community-based participatory research on the other end. And the key variable that shifts is really about the power and control of the researcher vis-a-vis the community, right? So in traditional research, as just described, the researcher defines the problem and puts forth the solutions and has all the power pretty much. This can be in a community, it can be community-placed research, but it's still more traditional. You can have community-based research where the community is participating in some shape or fashion. And then you can have community-based participatory research where it's really the community that's defining the problem, doing the research, putting forth the solutions. So that's an ideal typology. I think it's really helpful and fits for more traditional researchers, especially in academic settings and thinking about how to shift towards community-based participatory research. For PolicyLink, we're a research and action institute. Everything we do is around policies that advance racial and economic equity for the 100 million people in this country who live in or near poverty. So our research is maybe more non-traditional, right? Where we're trying to connect it to policy change. So the concept that's very helpful for us is research justice, where we think about rebalancing mainstream knowledge, traditional research, which is known, and with lived experience and cultural and spiritual knowledge. So in our society, mainstream knowledge is privileged, and that brings with it a lot of racist and classist undertones, right? It goes with that mainstream knowledge. We want to rebalance that. We appreciate mainstream knowledge, but we want to bring in lived experience, which is critical to developing solutions that work when you're thinking about poverty, financial inclusion. So some of the ways that we do that, the primary way that we bring in this research justice approach is through partnerships in which there is shared power. So we have many partnerships with national advocacy networks that are networks of grassroots community-based organizations that are rooted in community. And so we partner with them to produce research to support their work. Other ways that this shows up is around valuing that experiential knowledge, incorporating it into all of our research, engaging grassroots leaders to define what we do, what our research agenda is, compensating research partners for the knowledge that they are bringing to the table, co-creating and sharing ownership of research products. So seeing logos alongside ours on research products, providing rapid response support. Here we're going to do some research that supports your campaign right now. And then direct support and capacity building around research and data for grassroots leaders and leaders of color.
That's really helpful. Thank you so much for grounding us in that really important context. Sarah, you'd mentioned some of those guiding principles that are important to conduct this work in a really authentic way, in a trust-building relational way. I'd love to kind of move and hear about how some of these principles, right, whether it's engaging in power sharing, whether it's co-creating and sharing ownership of research, or, to your point, Sarah, direct support and capacity building, could you provide some examples of how you've brought some of those principles to life in the way that you've approached research? Jessica, why don't we start with you and then we can turn it over to Sarah.
Sure, thank you, Shaheen and Sarah, for really laying out principles. So part of this work in the financial empowerment context involves, you have this product and to make it effective is really understanding your customer, your community. And this comes down to access, fit, and outcomes. So thinking about accessibility, you need people to know your product or program exists. And to do so involves understanding who these people are and what are the effective ways of reaching them. We often hear meet people where they're at. Rather than trying to reach thousands of people, community engagement is about developing relationships and partnerships. so that you know where and how to reach people consistently, not just at a single point in time or because of a new product or initiative. And this feeds into fit and ensuring the products you design fit the actual needs and priorities, not just your assumptions of what people need. Even using data can lead to incorrect assumptions without community input. And think about outcomes. Community engagement will ensure that you know what you should be measuring to determine success, not just the people the number of people you're trying to reach, but engagement, long-term growth or change, and other priorities raised by the community. So focusing on access, fit, and outcomes raised by the community really helps ensure better results and more equitable results, as Sarah was saying. And the basis of this work is, again, partnership and trust. At Urban, we've partnered with the Cities for Financial Empowerment Fund, funded by JPMC. We worked with CFE to embed some of this work into the City Start model. And so they're partnering with local governments nationwide to identify financial empowerment goals, convene relevant stakeholders, including those community-based organizations, consumers, residents, to develop actionable strategies. And the result of these solutions, as Sarah was mentioning, is rooted in building local capacity, community empowerment, and local insights. So each local government team builds a blueprint that has equity as a guiding framework. And community engagement is a key approach to this model.
It's a great example. Thank you, Jessica. Sarah, I'd love to hear from you as well.
Yeah, our longest research partnership is with the Right to the City Alliance. So I'll tell the story about that. So it was back in 2017, the Right to the City Alliance is an advocacy network of grassroots organizations that are focused on renter rights, tenant protections. And we'd been working together and they wanted our support in their Renter Week of Action. It was a campaign where they were engaging their members in this week of action where they were going to do direct protests, standing outside City Hall with signs, but they also wanted to bring data around renter needs to decision makers. So we figured out collectively, what could we do within, I think it was a 3-month time frame, how could we lend some data and research support to this effort? And we came up with the idea of producing fact sheets for 42 cities that were participating in the Renter Week of Action, cities of varying sizes. So it creates, for researchers, it creates data challenges, right? Because it's easier to get deeply disaggregated data for larger cities. But so we were going to create fact sheets and build a narrative around how and why renters are contributors to their communities. You know, there is long-standing bias toward homeowners. I'm a planner by training, and like in city planning, you'll see this everywhere, right? But they wanted to put forth this narrative that renters are contributing. So the title of the fact sheets was "When Renters Rise, Cities Thrive." They came up with that title, which I just love so much. But we contributed analysis. We came up with a way of looking at housing cost burden for renters. So this is defined as paying more than 30% of your income on housing is supposed to be unaffordable. So what we did was we looked at, okay, if renters who are currently paying more than that weren't, how much more money would they have to pay for other family needs, childcare, transportation, education, and the like. So it was this novel way of using data that existed before. I mean, everybody has that data, but a novel way of looking at it around how families would be stronger if we addressed rent burden and unaffordability. And it turns out it was something like $6,800 annually that families would have. You know, a whole year of transportation costs and food costs and that sort of thing. So we did that analysis, we shaped the narrative together collectively and produced these fact sheets for these places so that the advocates on the ground, went in with fact sheets in addition to, protest signs. And so that's been a grounding for campaigns. And then other communities have asked for the same kind of data, elucidating the issue, how renters are increasing, how it's a racialized issue in terms of unaffordability. And then that's kind of developed into a longer line of research. We have a rent debt dashboard co-produced with the Right to the City Alliance that's addressing today's COVID eviction and rent debt issues. So it's been very generative. And I think, shows some of the elements that we created it together, built the narrative. We brought our technical skills to figure out this analysis, and then they're using it.
I love that example. It really shows the power of this approach, and certainly the action orientation, right, of the research. I think that was really well expressed in that example. So moving on to, some of the challenges, right, in this work, hearing from you both, I mean, it's clear community-based research is a very iterative process, right? It requires more engagement, more investment, and resources. How do you weigh the benefits and the challenges? What are some of the challenges and tensions you have to navigate in this work? Sarah, why don't you start?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it is, for us, since we are policy change focused, we're thinking about it in that context, like what is the research needed to support this policy change goal? So in that context, so that example I just shared, it was a 3-month window. So it was like, what can we do in that 3-month window? That's really different than if you're really trying to, if you have a longer time frame and have more time to engage community and think about getting direct quotes and interviews. And, so I think it's really, for us, it's really thinking about what can you do? It's really about strategy. What can you do within the window of time that's available? For a challenge we face is getting the funding to do research. It is difficult for us to get funding for research specifically, I think, because we are a hybrid institution. So I think that in general, like being able to access funding for the research work we do and infrastructure, building the funding to build the data infrastructure that we can draw upon, right, to service or serve multiple communities. It requires that investment in infrastructure. And that's often something that's very hard to raise resources for. Funders tend to want to fund something that's going to have like a new product at the end versus maintaining infrastructure.
Jessica, would love to hear from you as well.
Yeah, we share the same set of challenges, Sarah. And I think for us as a research, driven, evidence-driven nonprofit organization, I think it comes down to both funding, but also the research priorities and agendas we have going into any project. And oftentimes we're working with constrained timelines, and the communities we work with are coming from a place of both distress and due to a legacy of extraction. So we, as researchers looking to do more of this community engaged work, really have to both recognize and assess our own positionality in this work and sort of own that, and have that transparency built in early on in the process. And we're often responding to RFPs that already have a set of questions. And it's always, sometimes that's the funder, sometimes that's just what the policy is saying, the policy agenda at the moment. But it's really about flexibility and ensuring that timelines include that partnership aspect, that actual community engagement aspect to work.
Could I just add in, I think that the timeline piece, right? Every time we have, community engagement just sometimes adds time because you're sharing some data or research with community partners and they have feedback, and then it's you need to go back and share it again. And it sometimes can just take longer than anticipated. And it's worth it in the end, but that's just the reality.
Yeah, those are real challenges. I mean, I think you're both naming, right? Just like funding, right? I mean, as we've talked about, definitely we've heard a little bit about structural barriers and just conducting this research, but just the institutional barriers that are in place. And I know that we've got about a few minutes left remaining, but we did get a question that actually I was going to ask anyway, but there's a number of questions popping up in the chat about, just pointing to wanting this data, right? Wanting to conduct research in this way, but difficulty finding resources to pay for it. How do we get the necessary funding? How do we balance a desire for deep research with limited budgets? And to this extent, I mean, certainly funders play an outsized role here. And so if knowing that there are funders on this call, probably, and knowing where I sit, right, as a funder, how can funders promote true partnership between research organizations and community partners? What would you have to offer, right? And helping them sort of move towards this approach. Sarah, do you want to go first?
Sure. I mean, I think that, so our strategy to do more with the National Equity Atlas as a data resource is through building more of these partnerships with national networks. So supporting that, I think that that's a great approach to support these partnerships where researchers are connected with networks, so that and then both parties and the network partners get some resources, right? You always need to think about the cost of community to participate in the research. So you want to see some resources going back there.
It's a really helpful and clear call to action for funders. What about you, Jess?
Yeah, I think to your point, Sarah, accounting for the full cost of the research, from who's participating, intangible costs that you might not always foresee, staffing at the community organization, it's kind of the whole gamut. And also, fund research that community organizations want, need, and are able to lead. And I think part of it comes down to accessibility and the requirements built in, and how can we make an organization that is strapped to do this work, how do we make the application process a lot more smooth and easy to do in a crunch timeline? And also, this is happening. Funders are funding this work, and some of that is just requiring deep community engagement in your RFP. Maybe we had an example. The Department of Education actually funded a Promise Neighborhoods initiative, and they require that community engagement be a part of the application process, which create incentive to do this work.
That's great. Thank you, Jessica. We've got another question from the audience. What does community engaged research look like for private sector firms who are conducting research to inform product design? How does it differ from human-centric design research, which is increasingly popular in business settings? Who would like to take that question?
It's not exactly my area of expertise, but I would say some of the principles that I shared are definitely applicable to this context, right? So I think that people want to, so it's an interesting question, because I think technology and products, people know that there can be biases built into these, they know they can be harmed or helped by them. So I think that creates a desire to participate in the development of products and to understand the context for it, right? So I think it's just setting it up in a way so that people are contributing in a way that they are compensated for their contributions. So there's transparency in how their contributions will be used, where you report back the research to them. And I would think about how can you partner with organizations that are doing work in this area. Maybe they're, doing work around financial justice. Maybe they're doing work around tech equity, right? What are those organizations and how can you engage them who are more likely to be your critics in the development of the product?
Those are excellent applications of principles that are used in community-based research. Jessica, do you have anything to add?
No, all to say that I think when it comes to trying to get your product out there, it really comes down to knowing your audience and who do you want to actually use this product? Is this the right audience? And that really, I think, comes back to Sarah's point of it's baked into the method of design. At a really effective product, you want engagement earlier on in the process. Great.
As we sort of, we've got a few minutes left, but just another question that comes to mind is what actions does an organization, either internally or externally, need to take before even engaging, right, in community-based research, recognizing that this is inextricably linked to the equity journey of an organization, right? Would love to hear if either of you have thoughts on that.
I can share something that's also a follow-up to my previous remark, but it's understanding who is potentially vulnerable in this, whatever the situation is, right? You need to understand, like, understanding your community, the vulnerabilities, marginalized populations, existing biases, and populations that are facing discrimination in relation to whatever you're doing. So I think like understanding who really needs to be engaged is just critical to any of it, right? Because you need a targeted approach. If you're going to be equitable, you need a targeted approach to reach those who are likely to be excluded or left behind or who are just never at the table.
Absolutely. Jessica, anything to add?
I think along with that, both understanding your community and also knowing that they know what they need. And the result of that is, on your end, a better data and impact and sustainability of that partnership. And, it's a win-win.
Can you say more about the sustainability piece, Jessica?
Yes. So I think that really comes back to partnership. And when we think of, for example, having an opportunity to work with a partner through a grant that's a one-time thing, we don't often get to necessitate that that sustainable relationship, in the sense that once you leave a community, it's unlikely that they'll want to engage with you again. So if you actually create a meaningful partnership, have the funding to do that, and an investment as an institution in doing that work, it will yield better results and a sustainable kind of partnership.
That's really helpful. So I know we've got a few minutes left. Before we close out, I'd love to, just turn it to both of you, right? For anything you'd like to offer our audience, whether it's a parting thought or a call to action. Sarah, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, I hope that people don't feel intimidated by the concept of community-based participatory research or research justice. I think that there is always an opportunity to step in and, that it doesn't need to be the community defining everything. It doesn't need to be that far end of the spectrum for it to be valuable to begin to integrate methods into your work that are recognizing the lived experience, the knowledge, the wisdom that people or community is bringing to the development of a product or a research project.
What about you, Jessica?
Yeah, I think it really starts with listening and figuring out, maybe honestly taking a step back, recognizing you and your institution's position in it, and positively your ability to contribute and affect change when you really listen.
That's really, yeah, those are really sage words. So, I mean, just to sort of wrap up, and I think what we heard was, it's not and I think this message was reaffirmed earlier in another panel session. It's a both and, right? I mean, certainly there's a place for quantitative, more national research, but, I think with a pronounced focus on equity, I think leaning into community engaged research, I think, is critical, right, to address those inequities that we've talked about. So I just want to thank you both for your incredible insights and for your partnership on this panel. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.